Hello, everybody. This is Dan House. I'll be your moderator today. Sorry if there's some background noise there to start. Thank you for joining us. We'll be with us for the next 45 minutes to an hour for our 2018 People Management Industry Report. You're in good hands today with Catherine Spence. She's the head of product at Pomelo, and she'll walk us through this year's findings. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, just use the GoToWebinar queue, and I'll be mindful of that. And we'll get to those questions at the conclusion of today's webinar. So, Catherine, take it away.
Hi, Dan. Thanks so much, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you about the results of our industry survey, and it's one of my favorite things to do every year. We conduct this survey at the beginning of the year, and it really gives us a lot of insight into what HR executives are focused on, what you all are struggling with in terms of challenges for the year ahead. And we get a variety of quantitative data as well as qualitative data that really fuels a lot of what we put into the work that we do at Pomelo and Outmatch, respectively. So with that in mind, I thought I'd go over just some of the background around who contributes to this survey. We typically get over 500 HR executives, and this year we had over 600 HR executives participate, which is great. The participants come from all different industries as well as all different company sizes. You can see the breakdown on company size here in this pie chart. We like to look at the data through a number of different lenses, but typically what we're going to look at in today's breakdown is looking at some of the differences between how smaller companies with less than 1,000 employees treat priorities and make decisions, and what companies with greater than 1,000 employees are focused on and how they're making decisions. So that's one primary avenue of exploration for us. And then the second avenue is, of course, because we're focused on company culture, we want to look at how companies are focused on So what we're really looking at here is a variety of different statistics, but what I was saying, sorry, I got distracted there for a second, and I thought that, not that somebody was trying to interrupt for a second, but we're going to look at the breakdown of how different companies in different industries are looking at culture and what they're trying to cultivate given the context of what's going on in their industry. So let's dive right in and look at sort of the top priorities broken down between that first segmentation that I talked about, fewer than 1,000 employees and greater than 1,000 employees. And we do see some differences here, but one thing I wanted to call out right away is that we actually have 3 years worth of data now, and we're looking at 2016, 2017, and 2018 data, and we're just looking at what are the top 3 priorities across the different organizations. And what we're seeing here is that company culture and employee engagement are very closely aligned in one of the top 2 or 3 positions across all of the years. It's very consistent. We are also seeing a variety of sort of second order priorities like performance management, leadership, and learning and development. And those seem to cycle through that third position pretty frequently. So thinking through how we kind of contextualize this data, what I'd suggest and what I'll try to tie together today is that employee engagement and company culture are really foundational areas of focus for HR teams. And the reason for that is that they really are inputs to a lot of other programs being successful. So if you think about performance or leadership development programs, those types of initiatives are very hard to get right if you don't have employee engagement and company culture locked down. You can often feel like you're swimming upstream. So I think that's why we're seeing the continued focus on employee engagement and company culture as a result of that foundational work that companies are always trying to do. Now, I want to dig into some of the emerging priorities that we see. So outside of the performance management, leadership, and learning and development, we see a couple of other really key areas of focus that we expect to kind of increase and see more commonly in those top three over the next few years. And the first of that is recruiting and talent acquisition. This is always one that can cycle through more or less emphasis depending on the company. But I think right now, and what's making it so widespread as an area of focus, is that we're in an extremely competitive job market. And so as employers compete for job seekers, the professionalism, the employer branding, and the integrity of the selection process is really important. The second emergent priority is change management. Now, change management has been around forever, but one thing that we're noticing is that HR's role in change management is changing from less of an administrative role to much more of a strategic role, which is to say that I think that leaders increasingly realize that unless you restructure your people management initiatives, you restructure your culture and engagement initiatives, that change management is unlikely to go as smoothly as it should. The third emergent priority that we see in our survey results is inclusion and diversity, and this has obviously been top of mind for a number of different people. And what we're starting to see is the development of targeted tools to help employers better serve their inclusion and diversity goals. It's a really difficult problem to solve. One of the quotes I pulled out here is really emblematic of that. Everyone in our industry is talking about diversity, but the numbers aren't moving. We are going back to the drawing board to change this. So we hear this a lot. It's very hard to target and change those numbers. So some of the new and exciting technologies that are out there, like text.io, help companies reframe their job descriptions to be less gender biased. That's just an example of how these really concrete tools and specific tools will help employers in the future. The fourth emergent priority is managing remote workforces. And this is something that I think gets at a little bit of a generational shift that's happening, as well as touching on some of that competitive labor market. But we see that increasingly companies are accommodating remote workforces and that they're needing to restructure their HR programs to support that. The final emergent HR priority that we kind of pulled out to think about today is retention. And this is really the flip side of the recruiting and talent acquisition side of things. It is focused on identifying and retaining high potential employees. And so just as important as recruiting in a successful way, you don't want to have to be losing those recruits very quickly. So cracking retention is critical, and that touches on a lot of different aspects. It touches on development, touches on compensation, it touches on engagement. So there's a lot of different complexities to all of these priorities. Now, when we dig a little bit more into some of the quantitative data, we look at something like company culture, which is top of mind for almost everybody. And in fact, our data shows that 84% of our respondents view it as critical. And only 1% of people who responded to our survey said that culture was a luxury. So it's clear that it's very important, but there's a very big difference in the way that culture or the way that companies report either the strength or the weakness of their culture. And this is where the first big difference between smaller companies and more enterprise scale companies comes into play. We found a pretty significant gap between large companies and small companies in terms of the probability that they're going to report a weak culture. And the reason for that is that managing culture is difficult at scale. And what we mean by that is in a company that's small, you often have culture that's communicated very clearly and directly from the leadership team down to the most recent hire. But as a company grows, that line of communication, all of the informality that leads a culture to develop around what is the expected behavior, what types of things will lead to an individual thriving within this company or not, those things get diluted at a large company. And so you tend to see a similar dilution of the culture. So it is important to remember if you are working and managing a culture at a larger company that you will need to exert more attention to your culture initiatives just by virtue of your scale. Now, I wanted to pull out a couple of sort of more qualitative pieces of data from our survey to highlight some of the more nuanced aspects of managing culture. The first thing that I wanted to provide was just this word cloud. And one of the things that stands out is that the frequency of the word innovation with respect to culture is very notable. And innovation gets tossed around a lot. It sometimes is one of those words that people say it doesn't have any meaning anymore. But one thing that's worth noting is that, and we'll touch on this a little bit later in the webinar, is that innovation is oftentimes also about agility. And so noting that people are trying to foster a culture of agility is worth remembering in the context of what we'll be discussing later. The other things that I'll highlight is that we've got a couple of important sort of quotes and threads and things that I think are very commonly articulated by our survey respondents. One, this first quote here is articulating how many executives are struggling with really fast growth and the challenges of managing a culture of fast growth and seeing a rise in turnover as a result. The second thing that we see here is that we have the second quote, which is, we have a new CEO, so it should be interesting to see the type of culture he wants, but we're working towards engagement and empowerment for employees. And I'm sure a lot of you on the phone today can probably think of a time when you were working at a company that had a leadership change, and leaders do bring their own new set of cultural expectations, and that is something that proactively managing the existing culture with the new leadership sort of aspirational culture is something that's really important to keep tabs on. And finally, this is one that we hear so often right now, is that there are long-term employees who are kind of set in their ways. This is how we've always done it. And there's a younger workforce coming on board, and that gets to generational shifts. So generational shifts are very commonly one of the drivers of culture change within a company. Now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about employee engagement, which is the other top priority. And we wanted to dig into a little bit of the information around, how are people currently measuring their employee engagement? Are they measuring at all? And then is there a difference between large companies and small companies? And so what you see here is that by and large, most companies that responded to our survey are in fact measuring employee engagement, around 70%. So only around 30 or so percent are not measuring engagement at all. And the difference between large and small companies is that you see that there's a higher percentage of large companies that use an externally created software tool. And the reason for this is that when you get to the scale of, say, 1,000 plus employees, sometimes it's earlier than that, sometimes it's later, you tend to find that companies want a couple of things with respect to their engagement surveys. They want improved delivery systems. So using an internally built tool often means you're relying on less user-friendly survey software. They want increasing and more immediate access to analytics, as well as customization of those analytics. Again, something that's much easier to deliver through an externally provided software tool. And finally, expertise in constructing the survey. And, we've found that there's a lot of confusion and conflicting views on what engagement is. Having an engagement provider who has a broad and deep experience in measuring different aspects of employee engagement is incredibly helpful and brings a level of integrity to the survey process that might not exist with an internally created tool. So when we've been surveying folks over the past 3 years or so, one of the things that we've found is that we wanted to capture kind of the top 3 pitfalls and the 3 best practices for measuring employee engagement. And this is based on aggregating data from what we see our survey takers saying is problematic in their engagement practices, and how we see survey takers saying this is what they found that's worked. So the 3 pitfalls are not knowing what aspects of employee engagement you want to measure or what you want to do with that information. This gets to the what I was talking about just a few minutes ago, which is there are different components of employee engagement: job satisfaction, loyalty to the company, retention risk. Those are very different things. So knowing what you want to do with the information should help drive what you choose to measure. The second pitfall is what we call watering the weeds and starving the flowers. One of the things that we consistently hear is that companies often spend so much time worrying about where engagement is low in their organization that they forget to pay attention to what is working in parts of the company where engagement is very high. And finally, the last piece is not being prepared for exogenous factors influencing engagement. You can't control everything. And this is something that's just important to remember, which is that engagement will be rising and falling throughout the year, and only some of that is going to be under the control of the leadership team and the HR team within a company. Things as small as the weather can influence employee engagement. And so it's important to remember that you are not on the hook for everything, and to take into account instances where exogenous factors are influencing engagement levels. So 3 best practices. First and foremost, this is probably old news to everyone on the phone, but surveying engagement more than once a year is very important. And the reason for that is that engagement is volatile. As I mentioned, if something as small as the weather can influence engagement, then you want to be careful that you're surveying more than once a year so that you have an understanding of the trends, particularly if you're taking action. And that gets to the second best practice, which is don't survey and then fail to act on the information. It's extremely helpful and engaging to simply deliver results and provide some high-level actionable insights that managers can take away from the results. And finally, if your first plan for improving engagement doesn't work, then be prepared with plans B, C, and D. And so this gets to our final best practice, which is just experimentation is critical. And you most likely won't get it right on the first round, but if you treat it like an experiment, you will be putting yourself in a much better position. So now we'll dive into performance management, and we'll look at similarly how individual companies are capturing employee performance currently and what the differences are. So what we see here is that almost 60% of companies are using an internally created performance management system. And that's a pretty big departure from what we saw with employee engagement, for example. Only 30% are using externally created systems. And similarly, we see the same relationship in that larger companies are more likely to use a externally created software system for measuring performance. And so when we think about what's driving this use of internal tools versus external tools, and one thing that we wanted to posit today is that we see a lot of upheaval and questioning of traditional performance management methods. I pulled out a couple of quotes here around not measuring performance, but we do have a formal process. After 2 years of piloting, we launched a new performance management process, removing ratings and increasing development resources for managers and employees. So I think that what these are highlighting is an important trend, which is that we do see a movement away from traditional performance measurement. And that might be because even measuring performance can reduce employee engagement, which is a negative consequence that many companies aren't willing to accommodate. In fact, it even reduces the engagement level of your top performers. So, we have to really rethink, how performance management systems are impacting the workforce and whether they're having the desired effect. So we do see an emergence of these alternative methods. So it's not that many companies are throwing out performance management entirely. It's that there's I think a recognition that traditional methods are not achieving the desired effects, and that providing more resources around development and coaching alongside a performance measurement system is actually what's called for. So I'm going to shift gears now, and we're going to dive into the second part of this conversation, where we look at the different major industries where we have a lot of responses and data, and we're going to look at what's going on in those industries right now and how it might be creating the context for a very broad shift in focus in terms of culture. And so the first industry that we'll look at today is education. And what you are seeing in the education sector, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm not an expert in any of these industries, but we did reach out to a number of different knowledgeable resources to gather this info. What we see in the education industry is that there's a number of new business models emerging. Ed tech companies are continuing to grow. So companies like Coursera and Udemy are gaining traction. And as a result, we're also seeing traditional educational institutions rethinking their existing business models. We're seeing a bit more public and private collaboration as well. We're seeing a focus on changing or revolutionizing built space. Removing the sort of construct of the traditional classroom and rethinking how you can create the physical space for learning to take place. And finally, probably as a sort of tangential point to the new business models, we're seeing increasing use of micro-credentials versus traditional degrees. So that's the context for education sector trends. And when we take a look at how our survey respondents are saying their cultures are going to change over the course of 2017 to 2018, is we see this huge shift in focus towards adaptability. And this is something that started in 2017, in fact, but it grew very noticeably in 2018. So the intense focus on adaptability is increasing. And I think that this makes a lot of intuitive sense given some of the trends that we pointed to in the sector overview. When you see new business models emerging, when you see technology companies disrupting some of those new business models, what you are seeing there is an opportunity and a drive to be more adaptable, to be more experimental, to take more risks, and I think drive that adaptability focus. The other major shift is an increasing focus on results orientation, and that may be a result of again, a focus on new business models and also the increasing role that private sector companies are playing in the education space. In the health sector, we're looking at a slightly different set of trends. We do see there are increasing pressures on profit margins and a focus as a result on developing new strategies. A lot of those new strategies are going to be underpinned by new technology in areas like care delivery, artificial intelligence, and nanotechnology, to name just a few. There's also a move away from fee-for-service business models and a move towards value-based models. Now, the final factor and probably the elephant in the room is that there's a continuing regulatory uncertainty for all health sector companies. The probably most notable part of this is, what components of the ACA will remain in place, what components may go away. These are things that are impacting how health sector companies are planning. And when we look at the shifts that are expected in culture, again, we see this huge jump in focus in adaptability. And I think that this is similar to education, largely the result of a lot of change occurring in the industry. So I think even existing established players in the health industry are realizing that they have to become more adaptable in order to survive and compete in this environment. And we also see an increase in focus on transparency. And I'm not totally sure about this. My instinct about the increase in transparency is that we see more consumer-oriented or consumer-focused companies, and the demand for transparency is greater in those companies. But that's just a hypothesis that I'll have to confirm after we gather some more data. In the manufacturing sector, there's actually a bit of a different story or a different cultural impact. We see, again, the massive influx and influence of new technology. So the term smart manufacturing has become extremely common. Internet of Things strategies, IoT strategies are, I think probably about as widespread as they can get at this point within the manufacturing space. I think most companies have developed a strategy and are expecting changes to come as a result of implementing these strategies. We also see increasing levels of automation as well as the use of augmented reality technology. That one was a bit of a surprise to me. It was called out specifically by some very well-respected resources in this area. And so taking all of that together, when we look at what the changes are going to be, what I think is interesting is that in 2017, there was a real focus on adaptability, but that has really backed off. And we see that the focus has shifted almost entirely towards transparency. And what we attribute that to is as these new technologies permeate the manufacturing space, we expect that there is a related shift and need for increasing levels of communication. There's a lot more data that's available to manufacturers at every level of their organization, and that data has to flow freely in order for these new technologies to take hold. And so that's what we believe is driving increase in transparency. The move away from integrity, notably, is, I believe, inspired a little bit less on by that. It's almost like the new version of adaptability. And what I mean by that is integrity is and to a lesser extent precision, our focus on the sort of quality and ability of the product to meet specific criteria and specifications. And what we are seeing is that as these companies embrace new technologies, there is a need to move away from overly focusing on those quality-related questions. Now, that's just a hypothesis. I could be getting it wrong, but it is how we are currently interpreting the data. Now, in the finance sector, we see, I think, two critical trends here. The first is, again, AI, machine learning, and to a lesser extent, blockchain technology as well. And then the last is, or the second one is regulatory changes. So one that's impacting financial sector firms immediately is GDPR. And there are some additional ones that are driving or expected regulatory changes, as well as regulatory uncertainty that's driving the context for shifts in culture and values. So similar to the first two industries that we discussed, we see financial firms are moving strongly towards adaptability and to a lesser extent towards transparency. The trend of moving away from collaboration and customer orientation is actually continued somewhat. The move away from integrity is, again, I think something that may be related to the regulatory environment, not so much the part of it, the addition of new regulations, but some of the deregulation that's happening now is, I think, connected to that weighing less on the minds of finance executives and leadership teams. And last but not least, I'm going to touch on technology sector trends. This is the final industry that we'll talk about today. We're seeing a move towards centralization of technology. So as I'm sure you're all familiar with, there's a lot of different technologies out there, and consumers as well as enterprise customers are demanding that those technologies link to each other in a coherent manner. We also see probably the most striking use of AI and machine learning. I don't think any major technology company is lacking a strategy on this front, and we can expect it to impact the business strategy of these companies for the foreseeable future. Regulation in a similar way is probably coming down the pike for technology companies. Unlike finance companies, which may experience some deregulation, we do expect technology companies to have more regulation in the near future. And it's traditionally a sector that hasn't had a ton of regulation, but as we see some of these very large companies like Google and Amazon, Facebook, wield a lot of influence, we can expect to see that shift. So the change from 2017, there was a move away from customer orientation, which in 2017 I noticed, but it got much stronger in 2018. And my thinking and my hypothesis about this last year was that it was related to a move into more experimental technologies and a more experimental space, and that may be continuing. And we do see an increase in focus on adaptability, which would support that. We also see a move away from integrity, which, I think again it is a function of a need to move towards greater adaptability, as well as some of the new technologies that we see dominating in the space. So I've given you at this point kind of a really high-level overview of some of the insights that we pulled from our survey this year, and hopefully you found it interesting and engaging, and I wanted to open it up now in the last few minutes for some questions, and hopefully if I can't answer your exact question today, I'm certainly happy to follow up afterwards and provide you with some resources and some follow-up after the webinar. But I'd love it, Dan, if you could kick us off.
Yeah, absolutely. So so a few questions came in, and a lot of the questions are all kind of around the same arena. But one that stands out that you can help elaborate on is when you speak about the foundations of work for a company, you mentioned engagement and culture are two of those. Can you elaborate on which should come first, if one is, maybe a little more important than the other?
Sure. So my view on this, and the view that we take at Outmatch, is that they're both critically important. Culture is the one that sort of comes first, in the sense that culture is intrinsically related to your business strategy. So you have a mission, you have a set of objectives that you're trying to achieve, and from those objectives will flow a set of behaviors, ways that employees must organize their time and their priorities, act every day in the workplace in order to best execute on those strategic initiatives. That's the foundation of your culture. And what ends up happening from there is that when you align your HR practices, so your recruiting practices, your learning and development practices, your retention and career development practices with your culture, you will find that engagement rises. And the reason for that is that it is sending a clear message to employees about what it is that is expected from them. And that clear message is then reinforced by people and systems and processes. And when it's reinforced, it's validating. So the employees who are thriving will continue to thrive and feel validated in that process. The employees that don't thrive within that process will probably churn. And that's actually not a bad thing.
Fantastic. So this kind of piggybacks on how you finished there, and they say here, I really like our current culture and I want to preserve that. Will engagement then help identify what our culture is? So I guess they're asking, they need to identify what's making their culture so great and preserve it.
Yeah, engagement.
So how do we do that?
It's a really good question. Engagement typically will not tell you what your culture is. If you want to think about the difference between culture and engagement, culture is what employees believe, and engagement is how employees feel. So when you're surveying employees on their engagement, you're really discovering how they feel. Are they satisfied in their job? Are they looking for a different job? Do they feel loyal to the company? If you want to identify what your culture is, you typically have a couple of options. You can use focus groups if you're a small company, and lead an open-ended but structured workshop where you are going to seek to uncover your employees' perspectives on what's valued and rewarded. And it might be surprising to you, but that's one good way to do it. If you're at a larger company, you might need to use more of a survey-based focus, which is where tools like Pomelo come into play. But using a survey-based focus will help you gather that similar and that similar information about what do employees, what have they internalized about what's valued and rewarded, and that's the content of your culture.
Excellent. So let's do one more here, and this one's really interesting because it kind of dives into what could go wrong. So your opinion here is definitely warranted. If I'm not managing engagement currently, what barriers can I expect in my workforce?
What barriers to managing engagement in the future?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess they're not engaging. They're not using an engagement method with their current employees, and they want to know what kind of bad can happen from not doing that.
Well, I think it depends on the definition of bad. So I think, as I mentioned, some of those best practices that I pointed to earlier on engagement, like having an action plan when you survey engagement, surveying more than once a year. Those things are really important to keep in mind. You may find if you're functioning within a company that, maybe there isn't a strong level of trust between the employees and the management team, or there might have been some upheaval, some layoff, whatever it may be that's driving a more negative sentiment amongst employees, you sometimes do find pushback against surveys. And the important thing to do there is to commit to the program, be ready to change as necessary. So you might find that if you originally wanted to ask 20 questions in an engagement survey, that you might only be able to ask 10, or pre-communicating very strongly about what the survey is, what it's going to be used for, how it's going to help employees. So making sure that you're going the extra mile and communicating, what's in it for your employees in order to be able to get them to take that survey and take the time.
Excellent. Well, I guess we'll leave it at that, Catherine. Put some time back in folks' days that were happy to join us today. You did a great job. If anybody wants to reach out to the folks at Pomelo or Outmatch, you can get us pomelo.com and outmatch.com, two separate websites, or you can find us both on each, and request a demo or contact us for some more information. And you can always get me at thehoutz, Houtz, at outmatch.com, and answer any questions that you have regarding this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.